Good evening and welcome to the Minnesota History Center. My name is Kent Whitworth and I serve as the Director and CEO of the Minnesota Historical Society. It gives me a great pleasure to host tonight's conversation between two authors, David Hakensen and Annette Atkins. And I know many of you in the room know them both, and you are as excited about their conversation as I am. David's new book, Her Place in the Woods, has received much praise already. And I'll just share one excerpt from Betsy Bowen, who is an artist and illustrator from Grand Marais, and she states, "Her Place in the Woods adds so much to the story of Helen Hoover's life and work. The contrast between holding her own as a woman in a mid-century professional science and breaking away for her hermit life in the North Woods plays out very descriptively in David Hakensen's broadly researched biography." Many of you know already that David Hakensen and Annette Atkinson have both served the Minnesota Historical Society exceedingly well. They probably don't need much of an introduction, so let's treat this more as a thank you. I'm going to begin with our interviewer, Annette Atkins. Annette is a professor emerita at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict in Collegeville. A scholar, a teacher, a public historian, her real specialty is in transforming serious research into compelling stories. And this is especially evident in a couple of places. One is in her own book, Creating Minnesota, A History from the Inside Out. And then one of my favorite initiatives of Annette's was her annual gathering of historians for several years called Minnesota History, Whatever. What was so great about that conference is it was all about posing questions and solving problems, building relationships, and working together on all that is Minnesota history. Annette is both an emeritus and honorary counsel of the Minnesota Historical Society, and she served as the co-chair of the MNHS Creating Our Future campaign. Annette, I know I can see you now behind the curtain. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this conversation. And now on to David Hakensen, the author of the evening, we shall say. David is a strategic and corporate communications consultant who joined the Minnesota Historical Society Executive Council, which is our governing board, in 2012. After 13 years of distinguished service, he is wrapping up his last year on the Executive Council as immediate past president. David served as MNHS president from 2018 to 2023. Think about what was going on during that 5-year span. And as immediate past president, David chairs the MNHS Governance Committee. Maybe that falls into the category of no good deed goes unpunished. So 5 years as president, what do we do to say thank you? We give you 2 more years as chair of the Governance Committee. And of course, he's done a splendid job with that role. David is an accredited member and a 2017 fellow of the Public Relations Society of America. So that distinction as fellow is described in a couple of different ways. One is the gold standard for public relations professionals, and this is the one that I really lean into. And it's also described as the best of the best in their field. Well, I am telling you what many of you already know. David Hakensen is truly the best of the best. And I had the privilege of working very closely with him since I arrived in 2018. So David's devotion to this organization is inspiring, almost unmeasured. David's depth of knowledge across multiple fields and disciplines is so impressive. He has helped us think deeply and creatively and innovatively about so many different parts of the organization. But there's one thing in particular that I want to name tonight, and that is David's ability to elevate in the midst of almost any moment. And remember, we lived through COVID together with him as board chair and me as CEO. So I saw him in about every moment imaginable. And guess what happened in those moments? He elevated every time, and somehow or another, he found a way to bring out the very best in the rest of us. And for that, I am deeply, deeply grateful, and I continue to be in awe, David. We are so thrilled to celebrate you and your book this evening. As a steward of much of Minnesota's material culture, the Minnesota Historical Society, of course, has several collection items that relate to Helen Hoover. And if you didn't see them already in the display case in the rotunda, I encourage you to check them out after the program concludes. David, I understand from Gretchen that you were directly involved in the acquisition of at least that wonderful manuscript and probably several other things. So you see David's handprints, even, not literally, our curators and collections managers wouldn't like handprints, but truly his impact, even in the collections that are on display this evening. And so we encourage you to take a look at that. Just a little bit of housekeeping. At the conclusion of David and Annette's conversation, we will have time for Q&A. If you have a question, we will ask you to please use a microphone. And don't worry, we'll have to come all the way down on stage. We'll have a couple of runners that will bring a mic to you. But this is particularly important because we're recording this evening's program, and we want the question and the answer to be heard. So if you'll work with us on that, we'll make sure we accommodate you very quickly. David, I've got to tell you, it has been such a privilege to observe your joy and your passion during this book project, and also to witness your tenacity and your perseverance. Something to behold over these past years as you've researched and you've written your book, Her Place in the Woods, The Life of Helen Hoover. So without further ado, would you join me in welcoming to the stage David Hakensen and Annette Atkinson.
Such generous introductions. We had to stand behind that curtain until you got done. Thank you very much. What a pleasure it is to be here tonight, and what a pleasure to see so many people who I know, who I love, and so many of you who I hope to get to know sooner rather than later. It's a pleasure to be here with David tonight, too. I, too, have paid attention from the sidelines as he's been working on this book. And I have to say, I grew up in South Dakota. I didn't know anything about Helen Hoover, except I have this vague memory of reading one of her books in a Reader's Digest condensed book sometime back there when I was growing up. So I was thrilled to have David take up this project. Historians, we like to kind of be in charge of the history. So I was a little skeptical of this PR guy writing this biography of this historical figure, but in fact, it's a wonderful biography, and it's wonderfully written. I thought to start that I would ask David to give us a little, who is she?
So yes, Helen Hoover was a nature writer, as you've learned, and she lived on Gunflint Lake from 1954 until about 1971 with her husband, Adrian. And she wrote 4 best-selling books about nature and 3 books for the children's market. Before she went to Gunflint Lake, she was a metallurgist in Chicago, which a lot of people don't know about, and we'll probably talk about that this evening. But she had a very successful career before she decided that she was just going to walk away from corporate life and move up to the Gunflint Trail and live there permanently without a whole lot of experience doing that.
What's a metallurgist doing in northern Minnesota?
Well, good question. A metallurgist, if we can talk about that for a minute without getting too technical, is somebody who studies the different properties of steel. And Helen, when she was doing work during World War II at different labs, because all the men had gone off to war, she was able to get jobs there with a limited amount of college experience and learn how to use tools and how to use machinery, how to learn from the older men who knew all about metallurgy and taught her. And she moved around from lab to lab, and after the war she got this great job at International Harvester, one of the big farm implement companies, in 1948. What she was assigned to do there, she was given a project, and I think, being that she was a woman in a man's world at that time, I think she was given this project to see if she could do it, she would have a job, and if she didn't, it would be a pretext for firing her. She was assigned a project of trying to figure out this problem that Harvester had with farm implement, a piece of equipment called the disc harrow. And those of you who have been on farms know what that is. It's pulled behind a tractor and it turns over the field. These discs on the harrow would be breaking and costing Harvester a lot of lost business. A lot of people who were, the farmers had downtime and they didn't like having to replace their discs. It was expensive and it was time consuming. But she was assigned how to figure this problem out, and it's something that Harvester had been trying to figure out since 1900. And this is 1948, 1950. She takes on the project, and all this experience she had with different people working in different labs at World War II. And then she had reached out to the US Navy to see what they were learning from battleships that had been torpedoed and the strength and the tensile of the steel that they were researching, and then also US Steel itself, which was dealing with some of these because their customers were asking for help with how to harden steel differently. She figured out a way to harden steel using a salt bath, and I won't get into a lot of details, but it was the solution that everybody had been looking for, and she got 2 patents for it. So she was this very successful metallurgist and a woman without a college degree working among a lot of men. And she did not go back to her regular job after World War II. She stayed on. And she solved this problem, and it created a lot of issues for her in terms of discrimination from other employees and lots of other challenges, just because she had figured out this thing that no man had been able to figure out before.
And she's a city girl.
She's a city girl. Well, she grew up in Greenfield, Ohio, rural, but had no really involvement with agriculture. But she went to Chicago after her father died, and with her mother, and sort of clawed her way through jobs in the 30s, and then got these lab jobs because she had a high IQ, which a lot of people don't know, and she didn't really test for it. But she did learn that she obviously had a good aptitude. She had a college advisor that quickly figured out that she should be studying the sciences and not, literature and other things that women in the 1920s were going to college for. So that helped her, give her the confidence to do things that were different from what was expected of her.
So what year is she born?
She was born in 1910.
So she's born before women have the right to vote.
That's right.
So she's coming of age in a period when doing what she's doing is pretty unusual.
Yes. And go ahead.
Does she think of herself as unusual, do you think?
Good question. I think she knew that she was smarter than most people because she didn't suffer fools very well. And that became very apparent when she moved to Gunflint Lake because, she didn't have a lot of tolerance for sort of the gossip and just the backwoods people that lived up there. And she wasn't one of those types. She was coming from Chicago with her husband with 2 patents to her name, and a certain amount of pedigree and intelligence that just wasn't happening around, Gunflint Lake at that time.
She has 2 relationships that I'm interested in, one with her mother
Yeah.
and one with her husband, Abe. Would you talk about each of those a little bit?
Sure. Her mother's name was Hannah. Helen was born, like I said, in 1910, and her mother was 38 when she was born. Her father was 53. So when you look at that, 1910 and those 2 age groups, these are 2 parents that came of age in the Victorian era, in the late, 19th century. Her mother was very overbearing and domineering and had a very distinct idea of what Helen was going to do with her, grade school, high school, and college life. And it was going to be, you're going to do ballet, and you're going to do piano lessons, and you're going to be polite, and, you're going to be respectful. And she didn't allow her to date unless there was an adult present with those dates. She was involved in the Methodist Church, and when she finally went off to college, she was able to rebel a little bit, but her mother was very much overbearing. In fact, her mother would send her questions every couple of weeks in the mail when she was at college, and then numbered them, and if Helen answered them, then she would get points to get additional money from her mother her father died unexpectedly in 1928, not when the stock market crashed, but in one of the stock market bubbles before that. And he had a massive heart attack when he learned that all of his investments had disappeared. And he died on July 4th in 1928. So Helen there was enough money for Helen to go to college for one more year, which she did. So she had 2 years of college at Ohio University, and then that was it. But she was not going to live with her mother and her mother's siblings in a house in Cincinnati and be a secretary or some other thing that she did not want to do. She was going to Chicago. She wanted to see the city, and her mother had to tag along because she wasn't going to let Helen go alone. So, so they had a very fractious relationship living in Chicago in a series of flea bag apartments that were furnished and unfurnished, and until Helen could find some work that could allow them to move into better places.
It did feel like she gets tempered by her mother.
Oh yeah.
She gets formed and she gets strengthened by her mother's opposition.
Absolutely.
And Aid?
So Adrian, she met on a blind date through somebody at work. They hit it off very well right away. He was very much a gentleman. He had been an orphan. And back then, what happened many times that I learned is that if parents got divorced and the mother was to take care of the child, if there wasn't enough money, people would take their child to an orphanage for maybe a year or 2 or 3. And Aid's mother had to do that because she couldn't take care of him during the Depression, or before the Depression. So, so he was sort of somebody that just did pickup work and jobs all over the place. But he was an aspiring artist. He always wanted to be an artist. And Helen said to him, you know, Aid, you should just go somewhere where they're doing art, and you should just sign on and sort of be an apprentice and don't worry about getting paid, because you're not making much money right now anyway. It's the Depression. And he took her up on that, and he started doing some work for like advertising for telephone books and things, and so he could use his art. And then eventually, obviously, they became partners in life in terms of their work, because Aid illustrated all of her books, and Helen did the writing.
Talk a little bit about her books.
Well, her books were interesting. She did a lot of magazine writing early on, and she figured out, and this is an interesting sort of marriage between her metallurgy world and her world of writing. She did the magazine work because it was very easy for her to see things and write about them in a clear and concise way. And part of that was because she had had all those skills in the laboratory when she was working in those lab jobs. She would have to write these technical reports for executives, so they'd have to be written in a way that they could understand them. So she was very good at writing technical things and observing things and being able to write about them clearly and concisely. So she was doing a series of magazine articles, which led to a publisher approaching her about writing her first book, which was called The Long-Shadowed Forest, which was in 1963. And that was sort of a book about everything she saw around her cabin. You know, the plants, the animals, the fish, you know, mammals, birds, weather, all these sort of things. It's a very good book in terms of giving you a sense for if you were living in northern Minnesota and wanted a guidebook to all the sort of things that go on in your yard at your cabin. If you read that, you would be able to relate to it. It's not terribly technical, but it's enough to give you a primer on sort of nature and different things.
Is she a better writer later?
She's a much better writer later, yes, yeah. She had a lot of battles with her first editor. Again, here's where this high IQ comes in. She had an editor at this publisher in New York who wanted to challenge her on the fact that squirrels could not swim. There was no way a squirrel could swim. And Helen said, yes, squirrels can swim. I know this from technical books, and I also saw a squirrel swim. So, you know, I'm gonna argue with you on this point because I know squirrels can swim. And she also had written about a certain bird. I can't remember the bird now, but she had written about it for Audubon. She had done a lot of technical research on it. It was a bird that was native to the area of the Gunflint Lake. And she wrote about it in her book, and this editor, copy editor, was challenging her on it. And she had taken this piece that she had written and sent it to O.S. Pettengill, who was the foremost bird expert in the U.S. at Cornell University. Professor Pettengill. And he had vetted it and approved it before it was ever in Audubon magazine. So she wrote back to this editor and she says, well, if you're going to take this up with me, you're also defying, Pettengill and Audubon and all the bird experts in the world. So she didn't, she didn't suffer fools very well. So that led to her finding a new publisher, an agent. She never had an agent up to that point. And she landed at Alfred Knopf for her her second book, which was her best-selling book, which was The Gift of the Deer. Probably most people know that book. That's the one that everybody seems to associate with Helen Hoover.
Yeah, can I ask, how many of you have read that book? Okay, there are going to be copies available. You can buy them on your way out, right? But it's worth a look, would you say?
Yeah, this is the one that probably created a little bit of controversy for her, because what happened was a deer came into their yard in Christmas 1958, and she started feeding the deer, and then of course, more deer came, and it got bigger. And she basically followed the life of Peter the buck, which was the first one that showed up, and then Mama, his mate, and then their subsequent 2-3 years of fawns that came along with it. Well, the problem was, Helen loved this. I mean, again, scientific observation, watching them all winter, feeding them, learning about them. And then word gets around that the Hoovers are feeding a lot of deer, and they're corn and all this other good stuff, and they're nice and fat. And the hunters descend on the Hoovers after about the third year, and a lot of deer were taken over those next couple of years, and there was really nothing the Hoovers could do after they had sort of gotten the word out to the deer world that, we feed deer here. So
and we don't hunt them.
and we don't hunt them. So it was tragic, but it was very. It came at a point when the Hoovers were on Gunflint Lake. They had been up there about 4 years, so they had been through the toughest years of living there. She had started to make a little bit of money from magazine writing, so they were in a little bit of money, but not much. So and there was not a lot of development yet on Gunflint Trail and Lake. So it was sort of the most idyllic time, even though they were still not, getting by, but it was to her the most peaceful.
Yeah.
And that's why that book was so important for her to write.
Well, it's funny, it's idyllic in only the most brutal kind of way, right? Describe their circumstances.
Well, they bought the cabin in 1948 after looking for this place in the woods that they wanted to have. And they used it for 6 years in the summer, like most people do. They would take their 2-week corporate vacations up there and spend the summer working on the cabin and doing all sorts of things. But when they decided to move up there in 1954, they had never experienced a winter on Gunflint Trail or Lake. They had no running water. They got water out of Gunflint Lake every day. They had electricity that, not real electricity, but electricity that ran off of a wind plant that occasionally worked. And they had an oil furnace that sometimes worked, but didn't really heat the place properly, and then a cook stove. So they really were not prepared to spend a winter in Gunflint, winters are harsh, we all know that, and 40 or 50 degrees below zero was common, and they had absolutely no business being up there, living there.
What was she doing there?
Well, she had chased this dream. Aide had proposed to her at a state park in Illinois that had the farthest south growth of first growth white pine in the U.S. So, and it's still there. I've been there. It's a very beautiful park. It's kind of a weird park. It's like all of a sudden you're driving through farmland in western Illinois, and then all of a sudden there's this, it gets to be a little bit of a rolling hill, and all of a sudden there's this sort of like the Lost 40 in northern Minnesota, except that there's no other forest. It's just like farmland. So you kind of go, well, this is weird. So, but it's beautiful, and Aide had proposed to her there, and they made a pact then that said, this is 1931, they said, someday we will live in the woods. And they both sort of agreed to do that, and probably it was the moment of getting the engagement ring and romance and all of that stuff. But they stayed committed to that idea, and they eventually found their way to Gunflint Lake.
There were a variety of people who were escaping the city for the country in that same period. These two go for very specific, very nature-related reasons, which is really to get away.
Yeah, although it's interesting, in Helen's correspondence that I did a lot of research on, she would say people always think that we escaped Chicago, that we ran away from something. And she said we never ran away from anything, we ran to something. And I thought that was interesting.
Do you believe her?
I do.
Okay.
I do, based on the fact that she always wanted to write, and that she was made this pact with Aide when they got engaged. And then they started looking for places during the 1930s, but they were just never satisfied at finding something. They were looking in Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula, and all those areas had been pretty developed by then, with people from Chicago and Milwaukee and Madison going that way. And eventually a resort owner, when they were looking and frustrated, said, you know, you should really try northeastern Minnesota, because that's still sort of wild up there. So that's how they ended up going to Grand Marais and then farther up the trail.
We'll come back to the narrative in a second. Where did you do the research?
Well, interestingly, it started right here at the Gale Family Library at the History Center. When I got interested in Helen after reading her books and wanted to learn a little bit more, I figured somebody had written a biography. Well, a woman who lived in St. Paul, had written a paper for her MFA at Hamlin in creative writing. And she had tried to write a full biography that just didn't get published. But she had sort of written this précis that she donated to MNHS and was in the library, and I found that. And when I found that, I read it, I was even more fascinated, because she'd done some of the early research on Helen's life, and she was a big fan of Helen as a sort of underappreciated, overlooked woman nature writer. And I could kind of understand that whole point of view, having read her books. And that's where I learned that all of Helen's papers and ephemera and all the drafts of her manuscripts were up at University of Minnesota Duluth. And that was just great to have all of that.
What constituted those papers? What was in there?
Oh my gosh.
What is in there?
Well, you know, it's interesting, because she probably purged a lot of things over the years. Which is unfortunate, because there's a lot of correspondence that's missing. But the good stuff, it's weird. There's a lot of interesting stuff, that people save, that they think is going to be important to somebody in the future. Of course, there's correspondence between her and her agent and her editor at Knopf, Angus Cameron, who was also Sigurd Olson's editor. And then some fan mail that had been returned to her when she wrote her last book. Because she didn't keep diaries or anything, so she asked people she had corresponded with if they had saved her correspondence to them to send it back to her so that she could reconstruct the years of the forest. And her children's editor at, because she wrote a monthly column for Humpty Dumpty's Nature magazine, he was particularly an intellectual sort of contemporary of hers. They were both Illinois people, and they were both for Stevenson, both in 52 and 56. So they kind of had that in common. And they would correspond about issues of the day, like nuclear war and things that weighed heavily on people's minds in the 1950s. Because back then, the Strategic Air Command planes would fly over the Gunflint and make a lot of noise, and it was very distracting for people up there, and there was nothing you could do about it. But it was something that was a fixture in daily life up there. But then there was a lot of the insurance papers, passports. She did have a very good 3x5 recipe cards of all the articles that she'd submitted to magazines, and whether they accepted them, whether they rejected them, and what they paid for them, and when they ran them in the magazine. So I had all of that to look at, and then I could go find those. And then she had lots of scrapbooks of all of her clippings about her books and reviews and things like that.
How much personal information was in those?
Not as much as I wanted.
That's just, yeah. What didn't you find that you would like to have found?
Oh, you know what? I took a note on that, because I knew you were going to ask me that, and I knew I'd forget if I didn't. So yeah, the one thing I really wished I could have found, well, it exists, but and my publisher was not able to get it either, she did an NBC Today interview on July 3rd, 1969, when A Place in the Woods came out, and she was interviewed by Joe Garagiola and Hugh Downs for 10 minutes. Wow. 10 minings, national TV. And the fan mail she got from that was like off the charts, and it just made her crazy, because being raised by a Victorian mother, you always respond to every letter you get. Mm-hmm. And she tried to do that in her life, and it made her crazy. And I talk about that in the book, that it just makes her nuts. She had a boyfriend in college that got away, and then she learned later that he died. And I went to Ohio University to find out about him. She had said something in a letter to her agent that a boyfriend had drowned one day in the spring. And I went to the Ohio University, and they found the story about this guy who died. But he was a medical student, and there wasn't any correspondence. She had correspondence with some college kids, but it wasn't him. And I was just like, oh, I wish I would have figured that whole story out. So that was sort of a an unfortunate thing. And then the other thing was that Parents, a magazine press, like many publishers today, they get acquired by other companies, and it just, all the archives get lost, and most companies aren't very good about keeping things. All of their archives were destroyed over the years. They're owned by a licensing company now. So, because Humpty Dumpty's is still published, but there was none of that, although I was able to benefit from the letters that Elvin Tresselt, her editor at Humpty Dumpty's, would send back to her, because he did, after she asked for it, send all of the correspondence from their files to him. But she did, to make her writing easier, is she cut them all up paragraph by paragraph and pasted them up to sort of create content for the manuscript. So there's all sorts of stuff, but it just doesn't make sense. So I really missed some of that. Whereas the conversation she had with Angus Cameron, I was able to find all of the letters that she wrote to him in the Alfred Knopf papers at the University of Texas at Austin, because they have all the Knopf corporate files there, the early ones from when Alfred Knopf was still involved with the company, because he's the one that donated the papers to them. So, and then I had copies of everything that Angus sent to Helen, because she had it in her business folder. So I put those two together, and I could basically eavesdrop on their conversations. And the other thing is that she wrote so much of her letters to him in handwriting, and she only used carbons in the most important business-related things. So it was interesting sort of puzzle to put together.
So why does she deserve a biography?
Well, she was a beloved nature writer at the time. I mean, she sold incredible amounts of. The first book did about 20,000. The Gift of the Deer sold like 50,000 books, and that's just unheard of for a nature book. And her subsequent books did well. And as you referenced earlier, one of the big things that happened after she did The Gift of the Deer is that Reader's Digest, her agent had shopped it to Reader's Digest as a possible future condensed book. And for those of you who are too young to know, Reader's Digest would take bestsellers of the day, and they would condense them to a degree so you didn't lose the story, but you still had the book. And they would put 4 of them in one volume, and they'd come out quarterly. So there were 4 a year. So what they would usually do is wait for a book to become a bestseller, and then it would be bought for the condensed books. Well, the people at Reader's Digest were so smitten with the early manuscript they saw in The Gift of the Deer, they said, we're going to take it right now, and we want it for this fall, because Knopf wasn't planning to publish it for another year in '67. So Knopf, which is very unusual for a publisher their size, moved up the publication date a year and condensed the production timeline into months. And so the book came out, sold 50,000 copies. Reader's Digest had it. It sold 1 million copies. She was paid $20,000 by Reader's Digest for that, $5,000 from Knopf for the manuscript for the book. So suddenly they're in money. In fact, they're in such money that Abe gets to go to Grand Marais and buy himself a new Mustang. So a maroon Mustang with no air conditioning, because they didn't think they'd need it, and they didn't think they needed to splurge on that. So go figure.
My first question when I finished the book was whether David liked her. Do you like her?
Well, more people keep asking me that, and now I'm starting to taint my view of her. I do like her. I think she was misunderstood, being that she was intellectual, and I can see being dropped down on the Gunflint Trail that she wasn't necessarily going to get along with people. She certainly locked horns with a few folks, but there were several people there who, Peg Heston, whose family still owns the Heston's Resort, was a dear friend of hers and stayed in touch with her after Helen moved away from Gunflint Lake. And I think, the thing about her that you asked in the previous question that I didn't really get to is, nature writing doesn't age. And we still read Thoreau, we read Walden, we read other nature writers, Muir, other folks. They stand up the test of time because they're about nature. Certainly every author brings a certain amount of their time to the book, like in Helen's case. But I still think as you read them, nature stands on its own, and you should be able to pick up any nature book from any time and be able to read it. And I think that's why we should be revisiting what she wrote, 50 years ago now or more.
Well, I'm interested to know, David, what about her connected to you? Why do you care about her? And you spent years, and it's clear all the research that you did. she spoke to you or speaks to you in a particular way that I'm interested to know?
Well, I think it was her writing. It just was interesting. It was, if you read all of her books, they're autobiographical to a degree because she's talking about her experience. But I think that part of it was interesting. I think everybody has this wanderlust of walking away from their job and moving to Gunflint Lake or somewhere and just deciding that I'm done with the real world and I want to look at birds all day and feed them and read books and go off the grid or however you want to define it. And I think there was a certain amount of that romance that I kind of bought into with what she did. So I think, and I kind of liked her sort of outsider story, particularly the parts about being a metallurgist and having to fight her way against sort of the norms. And that she wasn't accepted for the brains that she had, but that fact that she was a woman who didn't have a college degree, so therefore she didn't count. And I just thought that was, of course, anybody that studies history understands that you look at it in the times that they happened. Well, that's what happened. Like for instance, after World War II, she was expected to quit and go back to being a housewife or do this or do that, whereas she stayed, and all the men were coming back going, "Well, what are you still doing here? Didn't you get the memo that says you're supposed to leave?" And, she just kept plugging along. So.
Like many women who didn't go back.
Right. Yeah.
And we only have a few minutes left of this part, though we have 10 more questions that we haven't even begun to get to. To what extent is biography a craft, and to what extent is it an art?
It's both.
Okay.
So it's an art. It's an art in the sense that everybody who writes a biography comes to it with a point of view or maybe a point of view that changes. But the art part of it is understanding it and writing about the person and shining a light on them and giving them a voice that they don't have anymore since they're no longer here. And hopefully to help a reader of their writing better understand their motivations and how they came to do the things they did. I think that's an art to try to distill that, to synthesize that and make that happen. The craft part of it is the research and the being able to, I learned a lot of stories about Helen, but I wasn't able to verify them in other sources. I really wanted to try to get 2 sources for every sort of anecdote or thing that she said, because she could be in some cases a bit grand and bragging about certain things, and if I couldn't validate that or verify it in another piece of correspondence or something she wrote to this person, I didn't want to use it. And there was several things like that. So I think that's the craft part of it, is being able to be true to yourself and to your audience, and then also still tell the story. If that makes sense.
Excellent, thank you. And I think we're going to take questions. We have microphones out there. Who has microphones? Yeah, there are 2 at the top. Any questions? And it's always good to take a deep breath, talk to each other for a second. There's always this awkward pause when you ask for questions in public. So I'm happy with awkward pauses.
Usually Annette asks us to get up and do a stretching exercise, so I'm surprised we haven't done that tonight.
Very good. You really enjoyed it tonight, David. I'm intrigued by the fact that it seemed like you came across to writing later in your life, whereas I read her books many, 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 many years ago. Is that true?
Well, yeah. Well, I guess we have to define later in life. I first read Helen Hoover in about 2001, and a dear friends of ours who are here tonight gave me and my wife a place in the woods because we were looking for a cabin. And if you read A Place in the Woods, it's the story about Helen and Aid and their search for a cabin and the frustration with the search, and then buying the cabin, and then all the crap that happens when you buy a cabin that you don't realize you're getting stuck with. And that was a really, really interesting book for us to read. I don't know if our friends were giving us a subliminal message, but I think they were warning us about the things that would come. So then I started to read the other books, and this is in the 2000s. And I really didn't decide that a biography was, or that I was interested enough in pursuing that until 2008. So I guess I was still in my middle age when I was doing this, so to speak. So.
One wonderful little story he tells in the book is about Aid and Helen realizing that they wouldn't get deliveries of food during the winter. So they needed to order all of their food in the fall to last them through into the winter. That as just as a problem in imagination is a wonderful piece about this.
Well, when you think about Helen being this high IQ person, calculating how much food they're going to need for the winter, and I did pull something out of, that was one of the things that was in the papers that was sort of ephemera. It was her grocery list that she'd order. And I mean, it would be like 10 pounds of flour, or it was more than that, it was like 50 pounds of flour. But I put a list in the book of just one sample of her. But they bought another cabin next to theirs before they moved up there. It was just an opportunity that landed in their lap. So they ended up having like 800 feet of lakeshore. So this was the summer cabin, which they could only use in the summer because it wasn't insulated. And then the winter cabin, which you could use in the winter, and that was the original one they bought. So they would order this food. It would come up in the fall in pallets, and they'd have to drag it down the hill. And there would be, they didn't hunt, and they didn't fish, so they didn't partake in any of that, which was right out their door. And they didn't accept it from their neighbors because Helen was morally opposed to hunting. So they would order canned meat. How gross is that? Canned meat, canned chicken, canned beef, deviled ham, those kind of things.
And they didn't even keep chickens. Did they keep
They
chickens?
kept chickens because of the eggs. They needed the eggs. They wanted the eggs. But then they kind of died out giving eggs, and they just kept them as pets. So another mouth to feed beside all the deer and the birds and all this. The animals ate better than the Hoovers, I can tell you that much, in the early years. But then, cases of canned fruit, cases of canned vegetables, and then all the staples, salt, sugar, and then occasionally she'd order some sort of a dessert type thing, maybe Jell-O, I don't know. And then it would get shipped by a wholesaler up the trail in October, and then they had to figure out where they were going to put 6 months worth of food in 2 small cabins. So all the dry material went to the summer house where it wouldn't freeze, and the stuff that had liquid in it went into the cabin which had heat so it wouldn't freeze. And I tell you, they did that for years. It was just crazy.
So Dave, why did they leave Gunflint, and where did they go?
Good.
Great question. So there's a lot of dynamics at work here. So after the deer were killed, and this is about 1961, 62, and Helen's busy writing, getting her book contracts and all that. There's more development on the trail. The roads are getting widened. The resorts the REA is bringing electricity into the resorts, and better telephone lines are being brought in. The Gunflint Trail is being widened and paved. And the REA approached the Hoovers about putting electricity into their cabin. And she said, well, what's it gonna, what does that entail? And it's like 200 feet of your woods have to come down so we can run the line down and not have any concerns about trees falling over. And they said, no thanks, we're not gonna take electricity. So all of that kind of started to wear on her. And I think the other problem was that once she became an established writer, fans just descended on the cabin in the summertime and seeking autographs and wanting to meet her. In fact, she documented in a letter to one of her agent that she had, I think it was the summer of 67 or 8, like 176 people dropped in on them during the summer. And she's trying to write A Place in the Woods at this time. And because she had a high IQ, she had a writing style that was, she organized the whole book in her head, pretty much, in an outline form. In her head, she didn't write it down. And then she would get to a point where she felt she had it down, and then she would just go to the typewriter and it would just pour out. And if she got interrupted, there would be hell to pay. Like if a neighbor dropped in to say, something. So Aid ended up guarding the door, literally, to keep people away while Helen was writing. So all of that became a stress. She couldn't finish A Place in the Woods, so they ended up going to Laramie, Wyoming, and she wrote it in a motel there over the period of several weeks, and Aid did the artwork, and they were left alone, and nobody knew who they were, and that was fine. And then I think just because of all of that, they just kind of got tired of it, and they decided, did some traveling, and landed down in New Mexico, Ranchos de Taos. And they lived there for about 7 years, always promising to come back to the cabin and visit, never did. And she would write that every year to Peg Heston at Heston's and other friends she knew, because I've read the letters, and she said, we're very busy, we're doing this, we're doing that, and I'm writing this, and we'll be back though, because we love it there and all of that. But they never went back. They got run out of New Mexico because Helen had this affinity for stray cats, and they really accumulated a lot of cats, like 30 of them. And the authorities in Ranchos de Taos passed an ordinance to not allow stray cats anymore. So Helen was so indignant. I remember she wrote a letter to somebody invoking the Fourth Amendment, in fact, for whatever the Fourth Amendment is, and she was outraged. So they just moved back they went to Laramie, where she had stayed at this motel and befriended this motel operator, and that's where they ended up spending their last 7 years before she died. And they never went back to Gunflint Lake after 1971.
Can I ask you a question? I'm interested in what's the value of biography. David is going to have an opinion on that, but do you like biographies? Do you read biographies? Anybody want to speak in defense of biography? So many historians who make it onto the National Book Awards list and the Pulitzer Prize are biographers. Teddy Roosevelt. There are apparently 16,000 biographies of Abraham Lincoln, for example. And Americans seem to love biography, and I'm interested in that as a phenomenon. It's stories. Yeah, but their novels are stories too, right?
But it's connected to reality somehow.
Okay.
That's true.
Yeah.
Goes into a question that I kind of had. I believe it was C.S. Lewis who wrote his autobiography and had said that he was unable to kind of get the time and space to not be influenced by outside factors for it to be the piece that he wanted it to be. So I guess my question is do you think that was accomplished through Helen Hoover, through her biography, and through your biography as well of this?
Yeah, so here he is, a 21st century white male, getting into the head and the experience of this real kind of early 20th century woman. It's a kind of the magic of biography, I think, is that you can be in somebody else's life for a minute. Anybody else have a view on this?
The audience didn't expect you to ask no questions.
I love history, but I have a hard time.
Here.
I love history, but I have a hard time reading just dates and things that happened. But people bring it alive, and so when I can get into their heads, I learn and remember so much about that period of time.
Yeah, that in some ways it's a kind of critique of some of the work that historians do. Right?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. When I was writing the book, my editor said to me when I finally turned the manuscript in and he was reading it, he's going, you need more dates in here. And the point is, when you're writing like this, you are so knowledgeable and you're so in the head of the person and you're so much of the time that the dates are meaningless because you know them, you're living them.
Right.
But you have to remember the reader is being brought along on a journey.
Right.
And then I have to insert dates in there so that I can keep the reader grounded and tracking, because if they just read the way I wrote the first draft, they would be lost most of the time. But so these little inserts of, a date or a place or something are there to help tie the story. And the other thing my editor did that is very helpful is I need you to draw more about what happened in the Depression, to tie it to their own hardship so that people have a context for, Helen and Abe were living in the Depression, just like all these other stories we've heard about the Depression, but this is how they, adapted and how they dealt with it. So I think that's another important thing that editors bring to this process.
Yeah, I'm defensive about the attack on historians about dates, but I also hate dates. But what seems to me really important is time. When is it that this happens, and then how does it relate to all of those other things that are happening around the outside? What is it that makes her her? Right?
Yeah.
Back to the question, can you hear me? On biography, I thought she was a fascinating person and I wanted to know more about her. And that's why I read biographies, to get to know the person better.
Yeah.
I have an interesting story to add to that. So Helen, after she wrote The Years of the Forest, which was her last book, and somewhat of a melancholy book because it looks back on all the changes that she and Abe endured and talks about it more frankly. And if you read it, it's kind of a sad ending. I kind of was bummed out after I read that book and kind of felt really badly that the world had changed so much that it left the Hoovers behind, and Helen in particular. But in 1976, Jim Kimball, who was the outdoors writer for the Tribune, like way before Ron Schara. He was sort of the Ron Schara of the 60s. And he had worked at the Minnesota Department of Conservation at the time, and Helen had known him because she had needed to reach out to him for fact-checking on some of her books and magazine articles. So he went and visited them in ranchos because she was stuck on what she was going to write about next. And she was toying around with this lifestyle book of looking at her own life through the different years of hardship and different decades and different eras, and her editor and her publisher were kind of like, yeah, we could, that sounds like if you wrote it, it could, and you brought your writing to it, this could be quite an interesting story. So she was still not convinced of it, and Jim Kimball went down to her and visited her and wrote this column and basically reported on her angst about what's her next thing, because she knew that she wasn't going to write another Northwoods book because she wasn't living in the Northwoods, and she thought it would be intellectually dishonest to try to write another one when she didn't live there anymore. And he wrote this column that basically said all that, that she was struggling with the next book, and would you like to see her write an autobiography? And then he published her address. Post office box, and she got all of this fan mail. What's curious is that's the only fan mail that she kept. And I read all of it. It was bindered together. It was all the responses to this column, and she wrote everybody back. But I read all of them, and everybody said, I want to know more about Helen Hoover, having read all of her books. And she was ambivalent about that because she had some writer friends that she would write to, particularly one, a science fiction writer named Andre Norton. They were very good, fast friends by mail, and then got to meet each other and spend time together in the 70s. But she would say to Andre, they would, kibitz about publishing and the lack of royalties and the slow payments on royalties and all the things that writers complain about. But she would talk about herself to Andre and say, I'm just afraid about what I can write because all of my readers think of me as St. Helen of the Forest. And that they will never view me writing about anything else, and I don't know how I can ever, escape that. And she had a very clear idea, even though she was quite opinionated with her editors and like Elvin Tresselt at Humpty Dumpty and Angus Cameron, particularly about hunting. You don't want to get me started on that. She was very cautious about her doing anything to upset her readers. She knew that she had to keep things in balance because she knew that there'd be probably wives of hunters that were reading her books, and that there were other people that were, true conservationists that would embrace her books. So she kind of, had a clear idea that she needed to be careful, but she knew who they were, and they were, middle America people that wanted to get away from it all and live that sort of romantic life off the
And
grid.
she's not much present in her books about nature.
No,
You feel
no.
her restraint and her pulling back.
She's a
and-
scientist. She's observing.
Yeah.
And she's interpreting what she sees and writing what she sees for her audience.
Well, thank you for not just observing Helen, for giving us her story, for taking us into her life. Thank you.
Yeah.